Hello and welcome to episode 42 of Match It and the Other Guy. Kevin and I are sitting on the banks of Lake Wylie, or on my porch, which is situated on the banks of Lake Wylie in Charlotte, North Carolina. Kevin, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm warm.
We've got folks playing on the other side of the lake. I can see there's a little private beach on the opposite side of the cove from where we're sitting, and they're loving the water. I never know what we're going to be talking about, Kevin, but you hopefully do.
Yes, I do.
What is our subject today?
This one is actually another suggestion from a listener. Suggested we talk about DIY.
Oh, okay. DIY.
And shall we let the listener in who doesn't know what that stands for? I think these days of all the home improvement shows, everybody knows what DIY is, but expanded upon them.
Do it yourself.
Exactly.
Yes, and I do quite a lot of DIY.
Exactly. So I knew we'd have plenty to talk about. It's not usually a week goes by that I don't come back over here and there's a brand new piece of furniture built from something you've created in the garage.
That's because I've got too much time on my hands, I think. Yeah. How about you? Do you do an awful lot of DIY? I'm thinking you don't, but
no,
I might be wrong.
Not right. No. I probably did more as a younger person.
Yeah.
And we kind of can go back to that. It's probably the early days when it was just, you'd see a thing of wood and a couple of like wheelbarrow wheels or something like that, and you're going to make something out of it.
Right.
Hey, we can make that into a cart. I'll love the Little Rascals.
Sure.
And then we'll go barreling down the hill. But
that's not the DIY that we're talking about today, though, is it? It's really house repairs.
No, it can be anything, because that's probably where I fall into more of the just trying to create something.
Yeah.
But making things happen or whatever.
Well, I've always been a practical chap. I always have. My dad was, and my brother was, and so it kind of just rubbed off on me. But I suppose because of my early years in my career working as a mechanic, which is a very practical, hands-on skill, that leads into everything else. I think if you're gifted is the wrong word, but if you're skilled in a particular field, whether it's plumbing or electronics or mechanical work or machining or carpentry, I believe if you're capable of doing one of those skill sets, you naturally are more at ease working in anything else like that.
It helps the transition.
It helps.
It greases the transition to another.
And certainly, in my case, being a mechanic leads into so many other things. You're dealing with hydraulics, so plumbing becomes a natural add-on to that skill set. You're dealing with vehicle electronics, and so electronics is another one. So plumbing, electronics, carpentry, probably not so much these days, although working on antique vehicles, I suppose, there's a certain amount of carpentry, but my dad and my brother were both very good at using their hands for carpentry, so I learned that as well. But I enjoy working with wood. I actually enjoy the challenge of working with wood more than the challenge of working with different metals, which, again, from my background, might strike some folks as a bit odd, but I've always had a love affair with wood. I think it's a beautiful material, natural material.
I've always heard that it has such a warmth to it. And I guess that's it's a natural product from nature, obviously,
yes.
that has its own essence to it.
It does. And I remember as an apprentice mechanic working in a little Mazda dealership in Loughborough when I first started out as a mechanic, the boss of the garage asked me to make some little wooden doors to fill in what was effectively a workbench where we used to work the transmissions. He wanted to create some little cupboard areas beneath the bench. And I said, yeah, I can do that. I think I'll have a go anyway. I'm very pleased to say he was suitably impressed with the work that I did. He said, that's very good, Matchy. He always used to call me Matchy. That's very good, Matchy. I didn't think you'd have the ability to do that. And I said, well, I've always had a kind of a natural affinity with wood. And then he said just the opposite. He said, I've always had a natural affinity working with metal. And he said, the reason I say that is if you make a mistake in metal, you can always weld a bit back on. But you can't weld a bit of wood back on if you take too much off. But that's always, even to this day, curious enough, again, I never know what we're going to be talking about, but that memory was stored there from 40-something years ago. Yeah, him saying, if I make a mistake in metal, I can always weld a bit more back on.
Well, I actually kind of tell them about stories about DIYs. My dad, you remember, we moved down to Leesburg. He retired, and we moved down there just before I was turning 12. And I remember hearing Mom in later days saying the story of when we first moved down there. She's like going, what am I going to do with him? You know, he's retired, and
That's right.
what on earth? Well, he ended up kind of buddying up with a couple of gentlemen down there kind of in our neighborhood, and they got together and they started kind of doing handyman projects. And it kind of gave them something to do.
Yeah.
And they made a little money. Now, they were retired, really didn't, need that extra income, but they were happy to have it. It just gave them something to go out, and they didn't know what they were going to end up doing on a daily basis sometimes because they'd gotten connected with a realtor. Well, this realtor was always representing a property that maybe somebody had left in, not a good position or
Right.
whatever like that, and it needed to be, fixed up for sale. And they were constantly doing, carpentry work, attaching a door that had been
Yeah.
knocked off, putting the door frame back, roofing. They did roofing. They did painting, plenty of painting, just whatever. And he just found himself doing all these little projects. Now, again, he was a mechanical and then later on became a nuclear engineer in his profession. So
Right.
he had some skill sets.
Sure.
These were that was mostly, drafting something out on a board and sketching it and how it might be created or
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
Or here he was using more of the mind and the hand and the hammer at one time. But that kept him busy, and he got pretty skilled and enjoyed them.
One of my biggest DIY projects was the house that I restored, the first farmhouse that I restored in France. I restored a couple of houses. The second one was much smaller. But the first project I got involved in was this wonderful old farmhouse I've described and written about. And that house hadn't been lived in for something like 30, 35, 40 years. Excuse me. So it needed pretty much everything. It didn't have running water inside, didn't have electricity, didn't have any drainage, didn't have anything. It was an old abandoned farmhouse. And I remember looking at the plumbing and thinking, I'd never plumbed a house, so I thought, I can do this. I think pretty skilled with my hands, should be able to do this. And I've always had this idea that, again, going back on how we started this conversation, providing that you have guidelines and common sense, you should be able to figure something out. So I would look at how it was done before, look at how the plumbing or the wiring had been done and abandoned, so I could look at the old plumbing pipes that weren't attached to anything any longer and think, okay, yeah, I see how you've done that. I can get new pipe and recreate that. And so I did, and there is a great personal sense of achievement when I had to get water. If you looked at the front elevation of this house, gentle listener, in your mind's eye, there was a water standpipe connected inside the cellar on the right-hand lower floor. And I started to build the kitchen on the absolute opposite side of the house, on the left-hand side of the house. So I had to figure out how to get water pipes connected from the cellar all the way up the walls into the attic, across the attic and back down into the kitchen, and then connect it to a tap, a faucet. But the wonderful sense of achievement to actually turn the tap and just see that water coming out is like, wow, look at this. I've created water. it's a
Adore me,
thing.
for I have created aqua.
My girlfriend at the time when we were restoring this house, again, we had no running water. And so we had no shower. And the only way that I could take a shower after working a full day on the house was to leave the garden hose coiled up in the garden all day long that was connected to this standpipe outside.
Let it heat up.
And let it heat up with the sun. And then...
Which they will heat up pretty darn good.
And then throw the hose over a bough of a tree in the garden, and I would have roughly 30 seconds of warm water to have a shower before it turned freezing cold again. Yeah. So there's such a great sense of achievement. Wow, look at this, we have running water. It's great fun. Now, the downside of that is, talk about hubris and, look at this, I've created running water in the house. I plumbed the house from start to finish with 40 mil copper tubing. Not that that really matters what size it is, but it happened to be 40 mil because that's what the French use an awful lot of. And insulated it as I'd done it as well. I'd put in foam insulation around it all. And at the time, I wasn't living full-time in France at this time. I was doing some work on the house, and then I was still working in Benetton. So for the final few months, every spare weekend I had, I would hop over and do a little bit of work on the house in France and then go back and earn a little bit more money at Benetton and then be able to spend that renovating the house. So I went away in the winter, and I left my neighbours the telephone number, and I said, just if anything happens, by all means, please do give me a call. Well, you know where this conversation's going now. I got a call from my neighbours, and they said, we have some very terrible news for you. Every joint that you've put on the plumbing which was soldered correctly. There's not a problem with the soldering on the joints, but every joint is now frozen and popped, and you have icicles hanging out of every joint.
Oh.
Yeah. So I had to go. I said, well, thank you very much for telling me, and please turn the water off in the basement in the cellar. And then the first opportunity I had, I got back over to France and had to replumb the whole thing again, or unsolder all the joints and renew every single elbow joint that was on there. Because, again, not to get bogged down in the technicalities of what would happen, but the way that these little 45-degree joints and 90-degree joints are formed, it creates a very thin wall thickness right on the apex of the bend. And the soldered joints have worked wonderfully, but the thinness of the wall of the copper, every single one had popped and there was a little coil of ice coming out of it. It was remarkable to see. So I renewed them all and I put double the insulation on everything, and that cured it.
Yeah. That reminds me of, I've told you about our lake house that we had in Tennessee where I skied and all that.
Yeah.
We had I guess it was called the well house, this little cinder block little house.
Okay.
It was really just a four-cornered little square, and it had a little roof with a little bit of shingling on it. And I used to, as a kid, I said, I'm Snoopy, and I'd lay up on top of it. But
just picture that.
Yeah, you just lay flat and you're Snoopy.
Yeah.
But we'd go down in the winter every year, and I know Dad did every year. And I guess most years I would go down there, and we would open up the lift. You just lift off that whole roof and set it to the side. And then it was just the pipes and stuff, I guess, that kind of, control the water system and everything like that.
Yeah.
And what we would do is put in, Dad had this clamped aluminum shades that directs light.
Okay.
Like a work lamp kind of. And he'd put in a whatever nice bulb, like a 100-watt bulb or something like that.
Yeah.
And then attach it to a thermostat. So whenever the temperature dropped to a certain degree, the thermostat would then turn on the bulb, and that bulb, the heat off of it, would be enough, one little box,
it was just
to keep
enough.
the pipes from
Yeah.
freezing.
So
it's pretty simplistic, but it seemed to have worked every year.
It's a great idea.
And we just changed the bulb out every year.
Yeah. Funny you should say that my neighbours just over the road here have a well pump, and they have, to disguise the well pump, they have one of those rather bizarre looking false rocks,
yes.
right? And in the winter, when exactly that happens, you can see the bulb illuminating within the box. Yeah.
Oh, really?
I can tell when it's on. I know.
Call up your neighbor, hey, your rock's glowing again.
Yeah, I know just what you're talking about. Yeah, it's a very good idea.
Yeah. So, talking about working with wood, I guess this is one thing I was kind of proud of. Of course, we know I did a lot of skateboarding and such. Well, at one point, I decided I was going to build my own board.
Okay.
And this was well into high school. I was already driving by this time. And it's one thing, you can't just take a plank of wood because it's not going to have the shape. But there was a company, I think it was called Z-Flex, and they would sell what they called Z-Blanks. And it was already just the first stage of a skateboard where they'd already made the concave shape and then the kicktail at the end.
Yeah.
So all that had been pressed into it, but it was a square. The edges were kind of, not quite plied yet. And the middle was. Everything was glued and solid.
Yeah.
And then, so you'd buy this blank, and then you could cut out any shape you wanted.
Cool.
So what I had to do was I took a piece of I think it was poster board. I figured if I make exactly half, flip it over, trace the same shape, then attach them together with tape and lay it down, I've got two equal sides. And then you laid it across the concave of the board, in what you perceive to be pretty much the center. You probably draw a line down the middle, a little plumb line with pencil.
Yeah.
And then set it on there, trace around it, then get your jigsaw out, and jigsaw out the shape.
Yeah.
Sand down the edges, and really you could make any kind of shape. You could give it a wider nose, you could give it a thinner nose, you could give it I gave a little notch toward the tail, and then you pretty much, I think the best way to make sure your holes have to be right for the trucks to attach, because if they're off a little bit, they're not going to roll right. So you probably just get a board that exists, lay that down, trace the
use it as a template.
For your wheel hole, because each truck is attached by 4 nuts and bolts, and then sand it down, and then sand the whole thing and paint it.
Very good.
And I did that, and I put my own graphics on the bottom, and then I ended up doing 2 of them. I did a regular skateboard, and then I did a thinner one, which was called freestyle board for a different type of skating. Yeah. And I still have both. I still have both of them.
And did you find when you were doing board number 2 that you'd learned so much from board number 1 that board number 2 was a lot easier?
Somewhat. I think I did the trying to think if I did the freestyle one first, or it's hard to remember now. I think I did the freestyle one second, and being they're so simple, they're really equal on both sides.
Okay.
So you want them to be. So it's almost in a way a long rectangle
Yeah.
with curved edges at the back. So I did DIY my own boards at one point.
That's good.
If I could only turn into a major company that made millions, who knows?
I enjoy it. I enjoy it very much, and it doesn't matter to me what I'm doing, whether it's plumbing or wiring, or these days, more than likely, as you alluded to when we started this episode, recording this episode, making tables and cupboards and that sort of thing. But I enjoy playing with wood. I particularly enjoy playing with old wood, but I like reclaimed wood because there's a lot more story to tell.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I like that very much.
Well, and you made something out of some driftwood.
Yes, I cannot resist, gentle listener. If I see a plank of wood floating in the lake, I will take the boat out and try and get it, and try and catch it and bring it back.
You've rescued it.
And it usually happens after we've had heavy storm weather. And Lake Wylie, for those that are unfamiliar with the way the lake system works in Charlotte, Lake Wylie is the end of the line of 3 lakes. There's Lake Norman up in the north, and then Mountain Island Lake, which is kind of in the middle of Charlotte, which is where I believe that the drinking water for Charlotte is pumped from, Mountain Island Lake. And then all of that water flows through a dam system down here into Lake Wylie, and from here down into the Catawba River basin. So inevitably, Lake Wylie ends up with all the driftwood that the big storms, particularly it's like old boat ramps and things that are finally let go, and you get pieces of wood floating down. But if I see a particularly interesting piece of wood in the lake, I can't resist going and trying capturing it, and then I will turn that into something, whatever it is.
Well, since I've never done. Let's say you find a piece out in the lake, you drag it back and all that. What do you have to do to dry it out?
Just leave it.
How many days does it usually take before it's actually workable?
Not that long. If you leave it I would like to leave it for a week. You don't really want to be using wood that is wet.
No.
Or damp. And the reason for that is, twofold. One, it's very difficult to saw wet wood, either with a circular saw or with a hand saw, because the dampness of the sawdust will clog the blades. That's an obvious thing if you're used to using saws. But also, if you start to produce something from damp wood, the dimensions will change. So if you try and join 2 pieces of wood together that are damp, when it dries, it will shrink, and then you have a split line in between the 2. Even if you glue it, you're likely to find that the glue line will split. So
that makes sense.
You want to use dry wood as much as possible.
So, if you found something that was wet, I guess it depends on the type of wood. If it was treated or something like that, it could be warped or warping.
Yes.
As it's drying too.
You have to, and you just have to use more of an imagination with it than anything. You know that if you've got a plank of wood that is probably 100 years old. I mean, some of this old, whether it's oak or particularly if it's hardwood, lasts a long, long while. And it's probably been, used to find this a lot in France all the while actually. A lot of the wood in the old houses had been used 3 or 4 times before. The big main beams in my farmhouse in France were clearly taken from wooden ships. You could see where they'd been main support beams in ships, which I think at the time was quite common.
Yeah.
That when ships were broken up and decommissioned, you wouldn't burn the wood, you would take as much off as you could. And actually this was the same in England. In a cottage I had in Chipping Norton, it was exactly the same. That you could see the roof timbers that were I'm talking 200, 300, maybe even 400 years old. You could see where they'd been cut out notched out to hold different beams in the past. Mm-hmm. But when you think that some of those houses have been standing for 300 years, 200 years, you think that the life of that wood must be well beyond 200 years old. It must have been in a ship 300 years ago.
Yeah.
Anyway, obviously we don't get to that sort of degree on Lake Wylie, but probably some of these old boat houses have been around for the best part of 100 years. And you can see that as soon as you look at the wood and you cast your eye over it, you begin to see the potential shapes that you could make from it. But the problem is, if you want to machine that piece of wood into a straight plank, you will lose so much of its story because you're taking so much of the surface away. You get it down to the inner core of the wood, but you're taking all that wonderful textured detail away from it. So you want to keep as much as that as you can.
Yeah.
Just make something out of it, whether it's a cutting board or anything. It doesn't matter. It's the fun of making something from a piece of scrap wood.
Well, it certainly
that I
makes
like.
sense. Obviously, it's ever more front of mind than it is right now about reclaiming and reusing
Reclamation of anything for house restoration. I like that very much.
And what a great story. I mean, let's say you do have a cottage and you can tell that the beams came from an old ship or something. Say you're into nautical things. Well, how much of a charming part of your living existence is that?
And I tell you what, Kevin, I keep going back to that house in France because it was a tremendous challenge for me. It was a very enjoyable challenge, and the house, when it was finished, I was very pleased with it. But those big solid beams up in the attic of this farmhouse looked like they were absolutely destroyed with woodworm and rot. I mean, they're absolutely perforated when I first bought the house. And I thought, wow, I don't really, gosh, just the cost of replacing these beams would be enormous. I thought I'll have a go at cleaning them up. And I had a basically type of a hatchet blade, and I started to chop away at what I considered to be the rotten wood. And honestly, it was just over 1/4 of an inch of effectively rotten wood. But as soon as you got that away, and it came away very easily, like bark in a way, but it wasn't bark. The bark had been removed centuries ago. The wood underneath was iron hard.
Gotcha.
You could not drill into it. You could, but you would blunt the drill in the same way that you would blunt the drill if you were drilling into steel.
Wow.
It was unbelievably
that's not
solid
that
wood.
beam's not going anywhere.
Not going anywhere. Beautiful, beautiful old building. And I would delight in. Here's one little story that I don't think we've said on air before. I know I've chatted about it before, but not long after I moved to France, my neighbour, dear old Monsieur Fauconnet, he said to me one day, I was up on the roof trying to keep the water out of the roof, and it had pan tiles on the roof. Those old clay pan tiles that you see everywhere in France and Italy and Spain. And he said to me, do you want to see a little piece of living history? And I said, yes, of course. He said, what have you got? He said, bring one of those tiles down to me. Now these tiles, many of them were cracked. And I brought one of the tiles down to him. And he said, now turn it over. So you could see the underside of it, the concave side of it. And you could see on the inside, it looked like it had been, you could see the lines, the markings of an old sacking material. And he said that sacking material would have been placed over the craftsman's knee when he was forming the tile over his leg. He said the shape of that tile is the shape of the tiler's leg when he was making it.
Really?
Before it was baked. I thought, wow, look at that,
That is amazing.
It's just an old tile on a roof. And if my neighbour hadn't pointed out to me, it's amazing how you'll miss these incredible details of here was the witness marks of the guy that had made that tile 150 years ago. Right there is I love all that.
That is amazing.
It's
I love
fabulous. That. It's fabulous, all those little details.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah. And today, things are just, those will be pulled out 1,000 times a minute by some machine and bang, 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 bang.
Yeah. Yes, and it was quite common in France, and probably still is today, though many of those houses have now been restored. But the roof tilers, when they were building a new roof or renewing a roof on an old farmhouse, they would ask the owner if they wanted all new tiles on the house, which was, the answer to that was usually no, we want to try and keep as many as we can. For the authenticity of it, for the look of it, because new tiles look new and look awful in comparison to old tiles. There it is, that's the art of building. And so many of the roofers would put the brand new tiles would go on first, and then as many old tiles as possible would be reclaimed and put back over the top of them as the finishing tiles. Mm-hmm. So when you look at the building from the road, or from the lane, I'm going to say the street, there's not really that many streets in the middle of these little villages, they're just lanes, it would look like it's never been touched before, but you knew that the underside of it was all watertight. Yeah. Great fun.
I mean, you can't recreate old. I mean, you can't create old. You can make a facsimile of old, but that's about as close as you're ever going to get.
Exactly that.
It's only original once.
Yeah. I loved all of that. Building in France, to me, or restoration work in France, was a wonderful therapeutic undertaking. Things would take seemingly forever, but it didn't matter. And I would probably spend all day repairing and renewing the crumbled pointing in between the stonework, and I would probably end up after a day having covered maybe 2 square meters of stonework, which would make it completely impractical for any building concern to make any profit because it was taking too long. But I didn't mind, I could stand back after a day's work and think, look at that, I'm kind of pleased with what I managed to achieve.
Absolutely.
There. Yeah,
there's certain value in that for sure.
Yeah. Building is different in the United States to a large degree. It's not better or worse, it's just different. But a lot of those building materials that we use in America, very few buildings that I see now seem to be made of stone. Cost is too prohibitive. But to see those old buildings in Europe and bring those old buildings back to life, there's something very gratifying about that.
Yeah.
I like that, yeah.
Yeah, and they will stand, and it's not like a heavy wind's going to take them anywhere. So.
They are absolutely built to last 1,000 years. The walls are a yard thick. They're over 3 foot thick. But back when they were built, there was no real cement or concrete, and so the building material to put between the stones was simply clay. So, and my house was a classic example of this. When the builders were building this, and presumably most of the building work was carried out by farm workers in the winter when there was little work to do in the fields, there would be a pit in between the 4 walls where the red clay was dug out from the ground and used to put between the stones, effectively like mortar. So that would be, when the house was built, the cellar was fundamentally the hole that was dug out of the ground to release the clay to be used as the filler for the stonework.
Oh, double duty.
Double duty. But when you some of these stones, they're as big as hay bales. They must have thousands of pounds of weight.
Yeah.
They must have rigged up some sort of pulley system to get them up there.
Yeah, you didn't have this cat diesel grabber that would just pick it up and move it from.
Absolutely not. And I have such respect when I look around at those buildings, just marveling at how they were built, just the effort involved in building them, and what a pleasure it was to try and bring some of that back, because inevitably things start to fail after decades of not being looked after. But I would always try, again, guidelines and common sense, look how it was originally built and just try and reproduce it. Don't do anything crazy, just try and reproduce what they've done. I like all of that.
Yeah. Well, it's like funny, it kind of reminded me a little bit of the house that I grew up in. Dad didn't build it, he wasn't a builder, but he designed it. And then I remember he was always commented that him and his friend, they actually built houses across the street from each other, and that they used the same builder, and he always commented on what quality work he did. And I actually got to go in that house about 3 or 4 years ago.
Okay.
And the first time I'd seen it since the early 80s. But to see those structural, in the basement, the structural beams.
Yeah.
And the wood had gotten more and more browned over the years.
Sure.
And you could just tell by looking at them how solid they were. And I remember the new owners commenting on how well they thought, everywhere we've looked or everywhere we've discovered, we just see quality built into this house.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's an amazing thing. It's great that it's going to be there, a lasting legacy,
It always strikes me, again, I don't want to be critical of house builders. I'm not saying this for that reason, but it always strikes me as remarkable how quickly contemporary buildings are put together. I mean, these buildings over in Europe and the house you were describing there would take weeks and weeks and weeks, months, stroke years to finish.
Yeah.
And yet now, all around Charlotte, and I'm sure all around the world, houses just seem to boing. 6 months ago they weren't there, and then there's a housing estate built. There's a whole new neighborhood which simply didn't exist.
Well, and if the same team just built 15 of them, they're just like, well, number 16, A has to happen, then B has to happen, then C has to happen, and they just know it. And back in the day, every house was essentially different. Somebody's going to design it the way they want it, and it's going to be a totally different plan, blueprint, whatever you want to look at for creating it the way they wanted to, and they weren't cookie cuttered.
No, just different. But I've always had a passion for DIY, going back full circle to where we started our conversation, but particularly with trying to restore things to how they used to be, how they were originally built. Whether that is with a car, with an old Ferrari, when I was in Ferrari restoration, I was always told, and this is something that's always stuck with me, and it stuck with me again over in France, restoring the house there, is you have to be really careful when you're restoring something not to over restore. Restoring means bringing it back to as it was, not making a facsimile copy like you mentioned earlier
Exactly.
on, a facsimile copy of what you believe it used to look like. That's not the same thing.
There were mistakes at the factory that were on every model of that, and those mistakes
And it should be
should
the
be
same.
the way they are.
It should be exactly the same. And if something wasn't soldered, if a connection wasn't soldered in a junction box on electronics, don't solder it. You can solder it and it'll make a better connection, there's no question about that. Science will tell you that a soldered joint is better than an unsoldered joint, I believe, but if it wasn't like that originally and you're restoring it, then don't solder it. And on that note, I think it's time, it's time to go, isn't it?
Well, yes, that was very, very good, and we can thank listener JJ for that topic.
Well, thank you, JJ. Yeah, always love the conversations that we have, and JJ, thanks for that one. I've said this before, but I'm always pleasantly surprised how the subjects that we talk about here on Match It and the Other Guy bring back memories that you seemingly have forgotten for decades, then they come back to the fore, you know.
That's true.
Yeah, it's great fun. Join us again on another episode of Match It and the Other Guy. From me, Steve, it's goodbye.
From me, Kevin, it's goodbye as well.
Toodle pip.
Bye. You can get rid of that last bye if you want to.